of Cleveland. I'm Ellen Putman, a member of the Forum Committee, and I'm the coordinator for today's discussion, which has both remote and in-person audiences. Our topic today is the threat of Christian nationalism and Project 2025. We'll have Q&A from about 9:30 until 10 o'clock. Because we have a change in our sound system today, we ask that you write questions down using the index cards and pencils provided at the back of the room. Let our facilitators know if you need pencils and cards brought to you. We ask our virtual audience to put questions in the Q&A box. Also, virtual viewers can turn closed captioning on or off at the bottom of their screens. At this point, please be sure your phones are off or in airplane mode. Thank you. This program is recorded and will be available in a few days on our website at uucleveland.org. At this point, I would love to introduce our featured speaker today, Dr. Marvin A. McMickle, PhD. Dr. McMickle earned a Master of Divinity degree from Union Theological Seminary in New York City, with additional years of graduate study at Columbia. He earned a Doctor of Ministry degree from Princeton Theological Seminary and a Doctor of Philosophy degree from Case Western. Dr. McMickle was ordained to the Christian ministry in 1973. Among other positions, he served as pastor of the Antioch Baptist Church in Cleveland from 1978 to 2011, during which time he led the church in establishing a ministry for people infected with or affected by HIV/AIDS. This was the first ministry of its kind in the entire nation. Under his leadership, Antioch Baptist also instituted a community tithing initiative in which the church tithed out 10% of its annual budget to various community programs and agencies. And Dr. McMickle served as the 12th president of Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School from 2011 to 2019. He is currently the interim pastor at First Baptist Church of Greater Cleveland. Please help me welcome Dr. McMickle.
Thank you very much for first the invitation to be here. Secondly, the introduction with just one correction. I am no longer the interim pastor. They call a new pastor, and if I was, I'd be there right now. So here I am and glad to be here. Okay. So we're going to talk about, go back one slide. Okay, we're good. What is Project 2025? And what is Christian nationalism? And how are they connected? Project 2025 is, in fact, as I indicated on the screen, not a new phenomenon. It is as old as the presidency of Ronald Reagan. It began with the concept called the mandate for leadership. And it is designed primarily to create what is considered to be the unitary executive approach to governance. The goal of Project 2025 is to centralize as much authority, as much power, as much independent discretion as possible into the hands not only of the executive branch in general, but into the hands of the president in particular. What we have today is a 900+ page document, not surprisingly called the Mandate for Leadership 2025. It is an update, and to some degree, a frightening extension of what was written in 1981. It was written by the invitation of Heritage Foundation, but not exclusively by them. There are at least 100 conservative organizations that have employed over 400 scholars who've collaborated on the various chapters that comprise this 900-page document. But there are two things to remember as we think about Project 2025. The first is that it is a political agenda, and the second is that it is designed to be implemented by a fairly hand-picked group of non-elected officials who will serve to oversee these programs. There are considered to be four pillars, four basic ideas of this program. Number one is what is called the mass removal of existing civil service federal employees. When I say the mass removal, I mean anyone who is not prepared to swear loyalty, not to the Constitution, but to the president. If you'll do that, if you will swear to do whatever the president instructs or directs, welcome aboard. If you will not, you will be summarily removed without any civil service protection. Number two, once those who are undesirable have been removed, they'll be replaced by thousands of federal workers who will pursue the agenda of the president. I go back to this term. You probably have heard this term many, many times from various conservative politicians and advocates, the deep state. Well, the deep state are these, in their mind, unelected federal civil service employees. But more importantly, the deep state is anybody who does not consent to pursue the agenda of the Mandate for Leadership 2025. So point one is the removal of unwanted civil service and other federal employees. Number two, the replacement of those persons. And number three, the training of them. Now, training is an interesting word. You could put other words there beside training. You could put brainwashing if you want. But what it is the creation of a mindset of how government should work that is different than the existing democratic approach to political leadership. There's even an agency that is being designed to provide training. Presidential Administrative Academy. Sounds like a prep school. Presidential Administrative Academy, except this is the process by which Project 2025 will be implemented. And once step three is complete, then comes step four, which is the implementation of a 180-day implementation of this program once there is a new conservative administration in place. So four pillars that operate: mass removal, replacement of those persons with those who are loyal to the agenda and loyal to the president, training those persons, and then putting them to work in the creation of a 180-degree agenda. When you hear a political leader say that he might be a dictator on day one, all you need is day one. All you need is day one to put this agenda to work. Day two, you're off to a 180-day agenda, and there's no turning back. Here is a Steve Bannon's phrase. the deconstruction of the administrative state. This is the goal of Project 2025. This means essentially the elimination of multiple departments of the federal government, and then those that remain are placed substantially under the direction of the executive branch in general and the president in particular. Day one. What you have by the end of day one is a movement toward a unitary executive, which at some point could become an autocrat, which at some point could become a dictator, all of which can be accomplished on day one. The Department of Education would be eliminated, and you have a shift from public education in general, as we've known it for 100 years, toward parental control, school choice, and of course, a almost total control of curriculum. In a school that teaches matters of race, gender identity, or what the project calls systemic oppression, meaning that there are actual policies that prolong the oppression of minorities, the oppression of women, the oppression of religious minority groups. Anything that teaches that would become the basis for the losing of federal funding if a school district receives any. And in a school that provides any support for, any affirmation of, any defense of the presence and needs of transgender students would, of course, also fall under the attack of this unitary executive or this deconstruction of the administrative state. Next agency to go, don't ask me why, is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And underneath that, the National Weather Service. Now, there are two reasons for this. One, you might remember that one of our former presidents was being interviewed about a hurricane that was designed to go to Florida, but that he insisted would also go to Alabama. When it did not go to Alabama, and when the National Weather Service said that it was never intended to go to Alabama, and creatively took a magic marker and extended the stretch of the hurricane as if it was intended to go to Alabama, he was furious with the National Weather Service for contradicting him in public. And so part of this is the elimination of the National Weather Service, also because they are advocates of climate change and warnings about dangers to our environment. And because none of that is of any interest to Project 2025, they will be gone. So now we have two major agencies. Why you want to get rid of the National Weather Service for any reason other than vengeance, I do not know. Then you have the control of the Department of Justice and the FBI. Now, this is where I want you to really be concerned. I want you to think about what it means to have a unitary executive with unlimited access to the Department of Justice for issuing indictments and the FBI for issuing investigations, with no one to stop that approach to government. This makes it easier to start investigations. It makes it easier to harass political opponents. It makes it easier to deconstruct the administrative state. It makes it easier to go from democracy to autocracy to dictatorship. It will allow for warrantless surveillance. I used to watch a lot of movies where they would say, I want to get some wiretaps. And somebody would say, well, we got to go get a federal judge or a magistrate who will give us a warrant to do a wiretap or a warrant to look into somebody's background. Part of what Project 2025 suggests is that the unitary executive has the power to issue warrantless surveillance of American citizens. This is clearly a violation of two fundamental constitutional rights: the First Amendment, free speech and assembly, and the Fourth Amendment guarantees against unreasonable search and seizure. All of that is at risk under Project 2020. Next, the unitary executive would have the authority to order mass deportations of anyone, in quotes, thought to be in the country illegally, and at the same time to fund the completion of the border wall. A unitary executive can order oil and natural oil drilling on any and all federal lands. There was a fascinating discussion at the vice presidential debate the other day where this issue came up about drilling on federal land and building housing on federal land. And one candidate said to the other, I hope you don't plan to drill on the same piece of land where you're also planning to build new housing. How are you going to decide which federal land you're going to use for which purpose? That'll be up to the unitary executive to figure out. Another withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accords: the suspension of all regulations governing the protection of the environment and the protection of clean air and water. You will hear a lot about drill, baby, drill. A unitary executive can deploy the U.S. military and the National Guard, both at the southern border, to fight drug cartels and into American cities to quell peaceful protests by declaring them to be unlawful forms of civil unrest. Remember June of 2020 and Lafayette Square, and persons who were protesting the death of George Floyd, and the suggestion that, well, can't we just shoot them in the knee? Well, under a unitary executive, where there is no chairman of the Joint Chiefs, there is no attorney general, there is nobody who can say no, that order could be given, and all peaceful protests could then be declared sort of civil unrest. Imagine, if you will, a peaceful protest in Moscow, and what you've seen happen when peaceful protests are deemed to be a threat to the order. Now we come to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, another major target of Project 2025. Businesses will lose any federal contracts if they openly engage in diversity, equity, and inclusion, which means how do we assemble our workforce so that we have the benefit of multiple points of view, multiple lived experiences, and so forth and so on. And you will be graded about such things. And you could lose your federal contracts if you are deemed to be in violation. Hospitals would lose federal grant money if they provide gender-affirming care for transgender adolescents. Transgender persons would be banned from the military. Abortion will no longer be considered a form of health care. Medicaid and Medicare coverage will be ended for any hospital or clinic that provides abortion, not covering the cost of the abortion. Lose your funding if you provide them, however they're paid for. if you provide abortion care, which is not considered health care anymore, then this is what they're threatening to lose. Invoke the 1873 Comstock Act, which would prohibit the access to mifepristone, which is an abortive medication, by the mail. You can't mail it anymore. You have to go to a clinic or go to a pharmacist or go someplace face to face and pick it up. And you cannot use it after 7 weeks. It was 10 weeks currently, now 7. Of course, the ideal number is 6. If we could just get everything to 6 weeks before most women even know that they are pregnant, then we're really making headway, according to Project 2025. Now we come to voting rights. Severely restricting voting rights, practice voter suppression, and manipulate the vote counting process. Let's put all three together as a strategy. Restrict who can vote, restrict where you can vote, and restrict how the votes are counted. If you think this isn't already happening, look around the country and look at what's happening right here in Ohio with issue 1. Thank God we have a chance to deal with it. Make false claims about voter fraud. I won the election. And of course you didn't. Pass criminal charges, press criminal charges against those who have assumed to have cheated. Engage in overt voter intimidation. Have people at the polling places, in some states carrying guns, challenging people's right to vote, suggesting that if you vote, if you sign up, if you come present, somebody might be there to see if you have any former criminal charges. Anything to keep you from showing up. Limit the days for early voting. And in Cuyahoga County, have one drop box on 30th and Euclid. I don't quite know how far north, south, east, or west the county goes. All I know is there are some places where 30th and Euclid is a long way away by design. Challenge election results if the conservative candidate does not win. And finally, refuse to certify state election. Project 2020. Now we're going to come to this crossover from the project to the Christian nationalist agenda. Part of Project 2025, I quote, is to infuse the federal government with conservative Christian values. Now I'm going to give you a minute to think about what those might be. Who decides what is a conservative Christian value? Well, we've gone through some of them, and none of them are Christian. Who gets the right to vote is not a Christian discussion. Whether or not mifepristone is mailed is not a Christian doctrine. Whether or not climate change is real or false is not a Christian issue. So somebody's going to decide what are conservative Christian values. Well, here they are. Here is their version of conservative Christian value. In the separation of church and state. You may have heard Representative Lauren Boebert from Colorado, who said in a famous speech 3 years ago, "I'm sick of this separation of church and state stuff. The church should control the state." And the constitutionally defined separation of powers, so that the unitary executive doesn't just preside over the executive branch, but also essentially has the final word on the legislative and the judicial branch, either by appointment of federal judges or by the use of great influence on the legislative branch. For instance, there was a fairly substantial immigration program written by James Lanford from Oklahoma, not exactly a bastion of liberal thinking. And the Senate had agreed to it. And we could have had a comprehensive immigration plan until a certain candidate decided that it was easier to run on immigration than to fix it. And so, constitutionally defined separation of powers was violated. And the executive branch influenced the legislative branch to reverse itself on a bill it had already approved, so that the executive branch could campaign on the lies about immigration. I introduce you not to J.D. Vance, who we all know in Ohio, but to Curtis Yarvin. If you've never heard the name Curtis Yarvin, if you've never read anything from Curtis Yarvin, this is the person who most directly influences the thinking of J.D. Vance. He has a mantra which is called rage. Remove all government employees. This just keeps coming up. The problem is government employees, non-elected, who are believed to prohibit the agenda of something like this project from going into it. If you can remove them, replace them, train them, and then empower them, you can have the country that you want. I also introduce you to the name of Lance Wallenow. You don't know that name? Look it up. Here is the crossover between Project 2025 and Christian nationalism. It's called the Seven Mountain Mandate. Anytime somebody starts with God has willed it, you better watch out. God has mandated that conservative Christians should control the following areas of life: all of the media, all the government, all aspects of business, all aspects of education, all aspects of religion, all aspects of the arts, and most importantly, be able to define without contradiction what constitutes a family. If you face resistance, holy war might be necessary. The head of the Heritage Foundation was quoted this year as saying, "We can have a peaceful revolution if the left allows it. But if they don't, things may get messy." One more slide. This is sort of the skeletal frame of Christian nationalism. It's a quasi-religious ideology that has nothing whatsoever to do with the gospel. It is an oxymoron. These two words can never go together. There is either a Christian doctrine or there is a nationalist doctrine. But to bridge the two is to go back to 1935 Nazi Germany, when the Lutheran Church, long established, was co-opted by the Nazi Party And suddenly, to be a Lutheran was to be a Nazi. And to be a Nazi, of course, was to find cover, shelter from the notion that this was somehow blessed by God. So that Christian nationalism provides theological justification for Project 2025. Point number one, God has a preferential interest in and commitment to the United States. So God bless America is not just a hymn, it is an affirmation of God's priority. There's a wonderful movie, if you like comic relief, with the comedian Chris Rock, who gets elected president. You can believe it, Chris Rock is president, Bernie Mac is the vice president. What a great country. And he's running against a clone of Dick Cheney. It was the era of the movie. And this clone of Dick Cheney ends every speech by saying, not just God bless America, but God bless America and nobody else. God bless America and nobody. Well, that's what this is. That God has no interest in anybody else except the United States, and that all other nations are secondary. And therefore, America first is not just a political statement, it's a theological affirmation. America first. Now, point number two, Christianity should be the official religion of the United States, which then leaves those who are not Christian essentially outside of any access to influence. White Christians, primarily white male Christians, should govern the country. Maybe some white women. Maybe Marjorie Taylor Greene. Maybe the lady in Colorado who's going to spend the next 9 years in prison for manipulating the voting process. Maybe, but mostly white men. And here's their agenda. A religious minority should be allowed to impose its agenda on an entire nation concerning immigration, gun ownership, human sexuality, reproductive rights, and an America First foreign policy. God bless America. This is the last slide. A wonderful book by a man named Stephen Prothero with this quote: "The United States is secular by law and religious by choice." Secular by law. The law is we are a secular nation, not a Christian nation. And to the extent that anybody is religious, it is not because the state requires it, because you chose it. You could just as easily choose not to be under our current form of government. Now, here's a quote, famous quote from Mike Flynn, who was the first national security advisor for one of our former presidents, who said, "America is one nation under God." That's from the Pledge of Allegiance. America should be one religion under God. This is the national security advisor. That religion should be Christianity. With all of the power, all the authority, all the influence, the Department of Justice, the FBI, and a unitary executive lined up with the dissolution of separation of power to enforce this policy. Here's my thesis, my hypothesis, in response, here's what I think is going on in broad strokes. In response to increased secularization and the emergence of the U.S. as a multi-faith, multi-ethnic society, some people fear the loss of their preferred national identity of the United States as a white Protestant nation. Hence, MAGA, which we now know make America great again. I used to ask, when was the again? My wife was watching TV and she said, we just found out when the again was. One of the current persons pursuing the White House said that America's golden age was America's gilded age. The age of William McKinley. Before an income tax, before women had the right to vote, at the beginning of Plessy versus Ferguson, and the implementation of segregation as the rule for the world, for the country. That's the again. Robber barons, no labor unions, no right to strike. Let's hurry up and get back to that. That, my friends, now stop. He is what you'd have with Project 2025 and Christian nationalism.
Thank you so much, Dr. McMickle, for lending us your time and your expertise. We do appreciate that. At this point, I guess Jan and Nancy will take index cards with questions, and I will read them out. Somebody passed me a question. Oh. I guess our first, what? Okay. Plan for the worst, hope for the best. If Donald Trump is elected, how do we combat these policies?
I was given a strict order.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was thinking that.
Not engage in partisan politics. I've crossed that line once or 3 times already. If elected,
a certain person.
you don't.
That's what I figured.
Day one.
Okay. What are your thoughts about implementing a civil service exam for federal state elected officials, similar to USPS civil service exam that allows basic education on government functions?
Don't know. I don't know that a civil service exam at this moment is our chief priority. I think everything that you think about the normality of American public life, protections under the law, separation of powers, the independence of the Department of Justice, the refusal to use the FBI to pursue false investigations, all of that is at risk. And 49% of the country seems to agree with that. Somewhere we've got to find folks who don't think that's the way to go. But the fact that this race remains too close to call is for me a frightening thought.
Here's a good question. Is Project 2025 Truth being promoted in Cleveland churches?
Not in the ones where I go. But because there has been a fascinating fusion of conservative evangelical Christianity with Republican Party politics, I'm fairly sure there are a great many churches, particularly among white evangelicals, where that line has long since been crossed. We heard a lady say yesterday from the rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, this man is our savior. Well, that's not Christian theology.
Do you know how big the Christian nationalist movement is and what groups are involved?
Well, Christian nationalism is mindset. It's not defined by religious identification. It is a view of the world. I would say that the vast majority of people who embrace MAGA as a concept would embrace Christian nationalism as a justification for that agenda. Now, I don't think the average person who goes to a church thinks that way. But when an agenda is put forward and someone then tries to cloak that with this, God wills it, God designed it, people are susceptible. So I think people like myself and others who know what Christian theology is simply need to be outspoken in saying, well, that's not it. Now, whatever else you want to call that, political ideology, nationalist ideology, whatever else you want to call it, please do not link it to the word Christian. That's the oxymoron. So it's hard to know. There was this old phrase that Malcolm X used to use about the Nation of Islam. When they would ask him, how many of you all are there? He would say, those who know, don't say, and those who say, don't know.
Next question. Could you speak a little bit about if there has been a strain of Christian nationalism running through this country from its inception, and it's just we became aware of it in the 1980s? Has it always been percolating?
Well, remember that there were times in the nation's history, as late as into the 1790s, when whole sections of the country could not vote, for instance. Jews could not vote, Catholics could not vote, women could not vote, and of course, African Americans could not vote. So voting was restricted to white males at first if they owned 100 acres of land or more, and then later on, John Quincy Adams and a few others, just being white and male was enough to qualify. One of the most fascinating things that's ever happened in this country was in 1870, when African American males were given the right to vote in the 15th Amendment before their former white female slave owners, who didn't get the right to vote until 1920. So at least with respect to the right to vote, yes, that's been a part of our nation's history from its inception. The struggle I think that we're running into now is that the emergence of so much diversity within our nation, so many different religious traditions, so many different ethnic groups, and I would say the election of Barack Obama has driven some people mad, not angry, crazy. They could not comprehend how such a thing could happen. and they want to be sure that it never happens again. And now here we are with another person of color and a woman. Fine with me, but there's some folks who they're just apoplectic. And anybody is preferable to a woman of color. Anybody, including the present person, whose name I cannot call.
Names might not be spoken.
Names are not-
Is it actually feasible to implement many of these? I'm sorry, I just can't read these.
And
How can we immediately inform MAGA supporters of your information that you have given us?
they've been informed. This, when you hear the phrase, this is not a political party anymore. This is a cult of personality. And the cult leader is driving the train. And there is no one left. No one is tolerated to suggest anything different than what the cult leader said. This is Jim Jones. This is Guyana. This is drink the Kool-Aid. We're in serious trouble, people. Unless this is your agenda, we are in serious trouble. And we're 3 months away from inaugurating a new president, and whoever that person ends up being, it'll either be the continuation of democracy as we know, or it's going to be this. With no one to stop it, unless there is some sort of a popular rebellion, which will not be easy.
Are more mainstream churches speaking about this issue, or is it just here and there?
About
Christian nationalism?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think most people are asleep at the wheel. Unless the pastor is particularly, aggressive about it. There are some churches where this discussion right here could never happen, because it would be considered sort of non-theological. Why are we discussing this in church? So I commend you for having such a discussion, but in most places, this is not happening. And therefore, people don't understand the difference between Christianity as a historically normative set of beliefs and Christian nationalism as an appropriation of a name in order to sanctify a political ideology.
We have a few more questions from our virtual audience. Wouldn't the elimination of civil service protection and the abolishment of various departments take an act of Congress?
Normally. The question is, if a particular person were elected and made it known that that was that person's agenda, having already told you about the immigration bill that the Congress had approved, and then by request reversed itself, I think you have to accept the fact that the present Constitution of the U.S. Congress, at least in the House, is completely compliant. Completely compliant. And if by some fate, both houses of Congress, House and Senate, are controlled by the same party as a person pursuing this agenda, and if the court says anything that the president does as part of his official duties must be given immunity, you tell me.
We have time, I believe, for one last question. This week, a Plain Dealer newspaper article discussed use of AI to represent Adolf Hitler to an English-speaking audience. and some who heard it actually said that what Hitler said sounded pretty good to them. How can we as a society prevent such uses of AI?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the idea of manipulating information, of sending out bits and pieces of information, 90% of which looks like it might be right, but 10% of which is really very deadly, is already among us. I mean, we saw that in the 2016 election. We saw it in 2020. We're seeing it right now. Who controls the uses of AI it's got the whole world. Corporations are debating it. School districts and universities are debating it. I have no clue as to how to defend against it, except be careful what you read and choose to believe. It could be propaganda from another country.
Thank you so much for closing remarks. Our next 9 a.m. forum will be Sunday, the 20th, from 9 to 10 a.m. It will be on navigating the boundaries of free speech, balancing expression and harm. The speaker will be Andrew Geronimo, JD, who is the director of the First Amendment Clinic of CASE. If you'd like to receive our weekly reminders of forums, fill out the forms in the back of the room. You are welcome to attend our 10:15 a.m. Sunday service, either upstairs in the sanctuary or on the YouTube page. The theme today is Spirit Made Flesh. If everybody's body is sacred, how do we reflect that in our attitudes and practices around sexuality, identity, and boundaries? Worship leader Randy Partain and worship associate Stella Glazius will speak, and pianist Karen Tooley will perform. To see what else is happening in our congregation, check out our website at uucleveland.org. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great day. Thank you, Dr. I appreciate it.